Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Okay, so the Cuban Missile Crisis, everyone knows about that, right? That moment in 1962 when the world thought, oh, this is it, we're on the brink of nuclear war.
Right.
But most folks, they only think about it as, the U.S. versus the Soviet Union. But there's another player in the story, and that's Canada.
Yeah. And they weren't just bystanders,
No, exactly. They had a really unique perspective.
They really did.
And their prime minister at the time, John Diefenbaker, he made some pretty, controversial decisions.
Yeah, that's one way to put it.
And those choices, they ended up really impacting Canada's relationship with the U.S. and also how Canada was seen on the world stage. So in this deep dive, we're gonna take a closer look at all of that. We're gonna see how Diefenbaker's actions played out, and we'll use different historical perspectives to help us understand it all.
Yeah, we'll look at the realist perspective, the liberal internationalist view, and even bring in some insights from the critical school of thought.
Right. So to set the stage, October 1962, the Soviets put nuclear missiles in Cuba.
90 miles from Florida.
Yeah, 90 miles from Florida. Imagine that. The tension, the feeling that, everything could just explode at any moment.
It was a powder keg.
Right. And this wasn't just a regional conflict. This had global implications.
Okay.
Anyone interested in history, politics, international relations, this is important stuff.
Totally.
So now Kennedy, he understandably wants everyone on his side, right? Full support, no questions asked.
Yeah.
But Diefenbaker, he's not really known for just blindly following the U.S., even in a situation like this.
No, not at all.
In fact, he actually refused to immediately put Canadian forces on high alert, like DEFCON 3,
It was a shock, to say the least. Kennedy's expecting this united front, and then Canada just sort of pumps the brakes.
Right, so why the hesitation? It seems kind of counterintuitive given the situation, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does on the surface. But Diefenbaker had his reasons. He deeply distrusted this approach to foreign policy that's called realism. Realists, they think countries only care about themselves and power is all that matters.
Right, that whole might makes right kind of thing.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And Diefenbaker, he just wasn't buying it. He thought there had to be a better way, a more cooperative way to approach international relations.
Okay, so he's not just being difficult. He genuinely believes in finding a peaceful solution, even if it means disagreeing with the U.S.
Exactly. He's a big believer in what's called liberal internationalism, which is all about countries working together, through organizations like the UN, to solve problems, prevent conflict.
And this wasn't totally out of character for Canada, right? I mean, they'd had some disagreements with the U.S. before.
Oh, yeah, for sure. The Suez Crisis in '56 comes to mind. Canada actually played a key role in de-escalating that situation, even though they had to go against Britain and France to do it.
Wow. So Diefenbaker wasn't just reacting to this one crisis. He had this whole history of pushing for peaceful solutions, even when it meant challenging the big guys.
Absolutely. And, while the U.S. was busy cutting ties with Cuba, Canada kept their embassy in Havana open.
Really?
Yeah, they believed in keeping those lines of communication open, even with governments they disagreed with, which is a pretty bold move, especially during the Cold War.
So we've got Diefenbaker, this staunch believer in diplomacy, facing off against the most powerful nation in the world during a nuclear standoff. What happens next?
Well, let's just say the Canada-U.S. relationship got a little frosty.
I bet.
Yeah.
Okay, so last time we left off with this real tension hanging over the Canada-U.S. relationship. Diefenbaker, not exactly playing ball with Kennedy's plans, had caused some friction, to say the least.
Oh, yeah. You could feel the chill all the way from Ottawa to Washington. It was a turning point, no doubt about it.
It really was. So how did this whole thing, this crisis, how did it end up changing Canada's role on the world stage?
Think of it like this, the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was a real stress test for Canadian foreign policy.
Okay, I like that. A stress test.
Yeah, it showed everyone exactly how important it was to Diefenbaker to have Canada doing things its own way. Even if it meant disagreeing with the U.S.
So it was bigger than just this one issue, right? It was about what, asserting a different vision, a whole different way of doing things globally.
Exactly. And they'd already kind of shown the world they were willing to do things differently, remember?
Oh, you mean back during the Suez Crisis?
Yeah, exactly. Back in '56, Canada, they stepped up. They helped calm things down between the UK, France, and Egypt. They were the peacemakers.
So Diefenbaker, he was just building on that, showing everyone Canada was serious about finding peaceful solutions.
Right. He was sending a message. We're friends with the U.S., we're allies, but we're not just going to follow blindly. We have our own principles.
Powerful stuff. But it couldn't have been all smooth sailing, right? I mean, disagreeing with the most powerful country in the world, there's got to be consequences.
Oh, for sure. Things definitely got a bit rough between Canada and the U.S. It took a while for them to warm up to each other again.
And I imagine some people said, hey, Diefenbaker, you're making us look bad, unreliable.
Oh, absolutely. Some critics definitely thought Diefenbaker was damaging Canada's reputation, making them look weak on the world stage.
But hang on, wasn't there also this other side to it? Didn't some countries actually gain respect for Canada? The ones who, I don't know, maybe felt like the U.S. was calling all the shots a bit too much?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Diefenbaker's actions, they resonated with a lot of countries, especially those that weren't aligned with either the big superpowers. They saw Canada as, I don't know, a potential bridge builder.
Someone who could help find common ground.
Exactly.
So in a way, even though some people were criticizing Canada, they were also gaining respect from others because they took this principled stand. It's like this crisis forced the world to actually take Canada seriously.
I think that's a great way to put it.
Hmm.
The Cuban Missile Crisis, it was a defining moment for Canada's place in the world. They showed they were willing to stand up for what they believed in, even when it meant going against the most powerful nation.
What a legacy. But did it last? Did this change how Canada approached foreign policy in the long run?
It definitely left its mark. Diefenbaker's successor, Lester Pearson, he tried to, mend things with the U.S., but he didn't abandon this idea of Canada having its own foreign policy.
Really? I always thought Pearson was much more, on the same page as the U.S. He even won a Nobel Peace Prize for his work during the Suez Crisis, right?
He did, and that wouldn't have happened without U.S. support. But Pearson also saw the value in Canada making its own way in the world.
So it's like he was trying to balance those two things, being a good ally to the U.S., but also being independent.
That's exactly it. And, Pearson, he was really into multilateralism and international cooperation, too. He helped create peacekeeping forces and was a big supporter of the UN.
Wow, so he actually built on what Diefenbaker started.
He did. And honestly, that balancing act, it's become a defining characteristic of Canadian foreign policy. They've continued to be big on peacekeeping, on helping other countries, on tackling things like, climate change and human rights.
Okay, so we're seeing how Canada's actions during this crisis help them become known as peacekeepers, champions of diplomacy. But it makes you think, what if they just gone along with the U.S. back then?
What if they had?
Would the world see them the same way now? Would they have had the same impact?
That's a great question. Tough to say for sure. History's full of what-ifs. But one thing's for certain. Canada's decision to do things their way during the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was a defining moment. Not just for them and the U.S., but for their place in the world. It showed that even a country that isn't a superpower can have a big impact, and that sometimes the bravest thing to do is stand by your principles, even when it means standing apart from your closest friend.
It's like they say, sometimes you gotta go your own way.
Yeah, sometimes you do.
But all this focus on Canada's image on the world stage, it makes me wonder about the folks back home. We talked about how Diefenbaker's stance created some issues with the U.S., but it must have had an impact within Canada, too. I mean, surely not everyone agreed with him, especially with, the threat of nuclear war looming.
Well, you're absolutely right. The Cuban Missile Crisis, it was a really divisive issue in Canada.
I bet.
Some people, they saw Diefenbaker as a hero, a man of principle who stood up to the U.S. Others, well, they thought he was reckless, putting Canada in danger just to, boost his own ego.
Wow, so it really split public opinion. People arguing over what it meant to be Canadian, how close they should be to the U.S.
Right. And that debate, it played out in politics, too. Diefenbaker's stance, it actually contributed to him losing the election in '63.
So the crisis might have been over, but the fallout, it continued.
Exactly. It shows how foreign policy decisions, they have real-world consequences. And sometimes those consequences, well, you just can't predict them.
Okay, so we've covered a lot here. We've seen how Canada's actions during the Cuban Missile Crisis shaped their relationship with the U.S., how it turned them into this image of a peacekeeper, a champion of diplomacy, a country doing things its own way.
And we've seen how those actions, they stirred up a lot of debate within Canada itself, forcing them to really think about who they were and where they fit in the world.
It's an incredible story, but there's one more piece to explore. Peacekeeping. It seems like that's become a huge part of Canada's identity.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Canada, they've been involved in almost every major UN peacekeeping mission since the 50s, sending troops, diplomats, aid workers, you name it, to some of those dangerous places on Earth. all in the name of peace.
Wow, so they're not just talking the talk, they're walking the walk.
Right. And people have noticed. Canada, they've earned a reputation for being really good at peacekeeping. Impartial, people trust them to mediate, to protect civilians, to help rebuild after wars.
So they're the ones you call when things get really bad.
Pretty much. And it's a role they've really taken to heart. Peacekeeping has become a big part of what it means to be Canadian, something they're really proud of. It shows their commitment to making the world a better, more peaceful place.
Okay, so we've seen how Canada's actions in the Cuban Missile Crisis kind of set the stage for their role as peacekeepers, diplomats, but we're missing one last piece of the puzzle.
What's that?
The consequences back home. We've talked about how Diefenbaker's actions rubbed the U.S. the wrong way, but there had to be consequences within Canada itself. Not everyone was happy with his decisions, right? Especially with the threat of nuclear war hanging over them.
Oh, absolutely. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a hugely divisive issue in Canada.
It must have been.
Some people saw Diefenbaker as a hero, standing up to the U.S. Others thought he was reckless, putting Canada at risk just to, stroke his own ego.
So public opinion was totally split. People were grappling with this question of how close Canada should be to the U.S., how much they should forge their own path.
Exactly. And that debate played out in the political sphere, too. Diefenbaker's stance contributed to his defeat in the 1963 election.
So even though the world avoided nuclear war, the fallout continued to shape Canada's political landscape.
It's a reminder that foreign policy decisions have real-world consequences, domestically and internationally. And sometimes those consequences are unpredictable and far-reaching.
So we've seen how Canada's choices during the Cuban Missile Crisis impacted their relationship with the U.S., cemented their image as peacekeepers and diplomats, and forced them to confront their own identity on the world stage.
It's a fascinating story, full of twists and turns and challenges, and it leaves us with a lot to think about.
Definitely. But before we wrap up, I want to go back to something you said earlier about Canada's role in peacekeeping. It's like that's become central to their national identity, a symbol of their commitment to peace.
Absolutely. Canada has been involved in almost every major UN peacekeeping operation since the 1950s. They've sent troops, diplomats, aid workers to some of the most dangerous and volatile regions, all to promote peace and security.
So it's more than just words, it's real action. They're putting their beliefs into practice.
Exactly. And the world has recognized their contributions. Canada is seen as a skilled and impartial peacekeeper, a country you can trust to mediate disputes, protect civilians, and help rebuild shattered societies.
They're like the go-to guys when things hit the fan.
You could say that. And they've embraced that role. Peacekeeping is now a huge part of what it means to be Canadian. It's a source of pride, a reflection of their desire for a more peaceful world.
Okay. So we've seen how the Cuban Missile Crisis shaped Canada's role as peacekeepers and champions of diplomacy. But there's one last thing we need to explore.
And what's that?
The fallout at home. Diefenbaker's actions caused friction with the U.S., but they must have also had repercussions within Canada. Not everyone was on board with his decisions, were they? Especially during such a tense time.
You're right. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a divisive issue in Canada.
I can imagine.
Some people saw Diefenbaker as a hero for standing up to the U.S.,
Yeah.
but others thought he was being irresponsible, risking Canada's safety for his own ego.
So public opinion was really divided. People were wrestling with this fundamental question: how close should Canada be to the U.S.? How much should they chart their own course?
Exactly. And that debate played out in politics, too. Diefenbaker's stance on the crisis actually contributed to his defeat in the 1963 election.
Wow, so even though the crisis ended, it continued to have a huge impact on Canada.
It shows that these decisions about foreign policy, they don't just happen in a vacuum. They have real consequences. And sometimes those consequences are unexpected and last a long time.
Okay, so to sum up, Canada's actions during the Cuban Missile Crisis impacted their relationship with the U.S., helped find their role as a peacekeeper and diplomat, and forced them to grapple with their own identity in the world.
It's a story full of twists and turns, challenges and triumphs, and it leaves us with a lot to think about.
Absolutely. But as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm left with this one question. What does all this mean for us, for the people listening? Why should we care about two countries disagreeing over 60 years ago?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
I think the answer is that even events that seem far removed from us, like the Cuban Missile Crisis, they still have relevance today.
How so?
They offer us a glimpse into how people behave, how power works, the tough choices leaders have to make.
So it's about understanding the human story behind these events, not just memorizing dates and names.
Exactly. And I think the story of Canada during this crisis, it reminds us that every country, big or small, can have an impact on the world.
It's a reminder that doing what you think is right, even when it's hard, can make a difference.
Well said. And it encourages us to think critically about the world, to question what we hear, to consider different points of view, and to be willing to stand up for what we believe in, even when it's tough.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks for taking us on this deep dive.
My pleasure. And to everyone listening, keep exploring history, keep questioning, keep learning.
That's all for this episode of The Deep Dive. Until next time. All right, so we're back, diving deeper into Canada during the Cuban Missile Crisis. We've talked about the history, the decisions Diefenbaker made, how it affected things between Canada and the U.S., and how Canada was seen by the rest of the world.
Right, and we've seen how Canadians themselves had to really grapple with their identity, figure out if they were just following the U.S. or trying to do their own thing on the world stage.
Yeah, and that whole debate, it's really interesting. So as we wrap this up, I gotta ask, do you think Diefenbaker made the right call? I mean, was standing up to the U.S., was that good for Canada in the end?
Ooh, that's a tough one. Historians have been going back and forth on that for ages. It's not a simple yes or no. There were good things and bad things about how Diefenbaker handled it. It really comes down to how you weigh those different factors.
Okay, well, let's break it down then. What were some of the downsides to Diefenbaker going his own way, diverging from the U.S.?
Well, like we talked about, it definitely caused a rift between Canada and the U.S. Kennedy, he took it personally. It wasn't just a policy disagreement. It became about trust, loyalty.
And that probably caused issues down the line too, right? Not just during the crisis itself.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Some people say it hurt Canada's standing in NATO, made it harder to work with the U.S. later on because there was this feeling that maybe Canada couldn't be counted on.
So by trying to be independent, they might have actually weakened their position in the long run. At least that's one way to look at it.
Yeah, that's one interpretation. And of course, there's the political cost back home. Some Canadians, they saw the alliance with the U.S. as super important, and Diefenbaker's stance, it rubbed them the wrong way. That contributed to him losing the elections in '63, ending his time as prime minister.
Wow. So a decision made on the world stage had a real impact back home. It's like everything's connected,
For sure. It shows how tricky it can be for Canadian leaders, trying to balance what their closest ally wants with what their own people want.
Okay, so we've talked about the downsides. But what about the positives? Did anything good come out of Diefenbaker's actions?
Definitely. For one thing, it really resonated with this growing sense of Canadian nationalism. A lot of Canadians, they were proud to see their leaders standing up for their values, even when the U.S. was putting on the pressure.
Like a, hey, we're Canada, we do things our way kind of moment.
Exactly. It was a win for Canadian sovereignty,
Yeah.
showing they could make their own decisions on the world stage.
And didn't it also kind of strengthen Canada's image as a peacemaker, a country that believes in diplomacy? They weren't just saying no to the U.S., they were offering another way, pushing for the UN to get involved.
Right. By wanting the UN involved, Diefenbaker showed that Canada wasn't just going along with whatever the U.S. wanted. They were committed to finding peaceful solutions, even if it meant disagreeing with their most powerful ally.
So while it might have annoyed Washington, it probably earned them respect from other countries, especially those that were, I don't know, maybe tired of the whole Cold War thing, the whole us versus them mentality.
Yeah, that's a good point. Diefenbaker's actions, they offered a different way of doing things globally, one based on working together and talking things out. And that appealed to a lot of countries who were looking for a third option, a way to not just pick a side and follow blindly.
It's almost like Diefenbaker was playing the long game, taking a hit in the short term, maybe to his popularity, to his relationships, but setting the stage for Canada to have a bigger, more independent role in the world later on.
It's an interesting thought. And when you look at what Canada's done since then, all the peacekeeping, the helping other countries develop, all the work they've done in global diplomacy, it makes you wonder if Diefenbaker's actions helped lay the groundwork for that.
Yeah, like that moment of saying no, even though it was hard, it became this touchstone for how Canada approaches the world.
Definitely. It became part of their story, something a lot of Canadians are proud of.
Yeah.
And it still shapes how they think about their place in the world today.
Okay, so we've talked about the tough choices Diefenbaker made, the good and the bad that came from them, the long-term effects. But as we finish this up, I have one last question.
Shoot.
What does this all mean for us, the folks listening in? Why should we care about this disagreement between two countries from over 60 years ago? What's the takeaway, the lesson we can learn from it?
That's a great question. And I think it's about realizing that Even events that seem like ancient history, like the Cuban Missile Crisis, they still matter to us today.
In what way?
They help us understand how people act, how power works, the kinds of decisions leaders have to grapple with. It's not just about knowing the dates and the names. It's about seeing the human side of it all.
So it's about getting those insights into why people and countries do the things they do.
Exactly. And I think Canada's story during this whole crisis, it shows us that even a country that's not a superpower, they can still make a difference in the world. It reminds us that standing up for what you believe in, even when it's tough, it can have a ripple effect, It can reach further than you might think.
It's a story about courage, about believing in something and sticking to it, about being willing to say no, even when it's easier to just go with the flow.
Well said. And it's a story that encourages us to really think about the world around us, to question what we hear, to see things from different sides, and to be brave enough to stand up for what we think is right, even when it's hard.
That's a great message to leave everyone with. Thanks for taking us on this deep dive. It's been really eye-opening.
It was my pleasure. And for everyone listening, keep digging into history, keep asking those tough questions, keep learning.
And that's it for this episode of The Deep Dive. Until next time, keep exploring.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.